Hello, I'm Andrew Watson, and today I'm going to talk to you about the potential impact of legislation on the supply side of the Scottish private rented sector. Specifically, I'm going to examine the temporary legislation which was enacted to prevent evictions during the pandemic and explore how landlords' views of the legislation could lead to a shortage of supply. I'll start with a brief overview of the research context and rationale before sharing key findings such as the scale of the problem, details on how arrears are being managed by landlords, and the ability of landlords to sustain further arrears. Thereafter, I'll discuss how landlords perceive the temporary legislation and the implications these perceptions have for future supply. At the outset of the pandemic, policymakers moved quickly to introduce legislation that would prevent households from being evicted. In doing so, it also prevented local authorities from being overwhelmed by the financial and administrative burden a spike in homelessness cases would bring. The legislation therefore transferred some of the costs of the pandemic from individuals and public bodies onto private landlords. The legislation was introduced in 4 stages. The first increased notice periods from 28 days to 6 months for tenancies with 3 months of rent arrears. The second added a requirement for landlords to provide more advice to tenants before pursuing eviction. The third stage was the introduction of legislation which was widely reported as an eviction ban. The ban was originally due to expire on the 22nd of January 2021. However, it was subsequently incorporated into legislation which linked the ban to the local level system for social distancing, so that it applied to all areas under Level 3 or Level 4 restrictions. The fourth stage extended certain provisions of the previous 3 stages from September 21 to March 22, and potentially to September 22, via further secondary legislation. This means that some temporary measures will remain in place until at least March 2022, 2 years after the start of the pandemic. The legislation meant that it would take around 12 months for landlords to receive an eviction order for non-payment, equating to over £8,000 in lost rent. Nick Bailey and myself observed that despite some warning of a looming tsunami or tidal wave of evictions, that there was in fact very little data on the full extent of arrears, or the ability of landlords to sustain arrears or their intentions towards them. Furthermore, due to the nature of the pandemic, policymakers lent on representative bodies in lieu of broader consultative processes. We set about addressing this data shortfall via a study which was funded by the UKRI. We issued an online survey to landlords throughout Scotland with the assistance of membership organisations, deposit protection providers and others. We weighted the resultant data to achieve a geographically representative sample and found that the characteristics therein broadly matched those of previous studies. We found that around 45,000 landlords in Scotland were facing arrears of up to £126 million. On the tenant side, this equates to roughly 13% of the 340,000 households living within the PRS. Although the number could be far higher given that some landlords had multiple properties in arrears. This is a significant financial burden for landlords to carry, particularly as many had themselves been directly impacted by the pandemic. The majority of landlords had tried to engage with tenants over current arrears. However, 42% of landlords suggested that tenants had not engaged. This suggests that a large number of tenants were burying their heads in the sand rather than facing up to the financial problems. Just over half of landlords had managed to agree interim payment plans with their tenants, but just over half of those had adhered to the payment plans. While many landlords intended to recoup these arrears, most accepted that they would be unlikely to be able to do so. Obviously not all tenants needed help with rent, but just under half of landlords had offered some in the form of either rent holidays, rent deferment or other means. Overall, landlords reported trying to work with tenants to support them through the pandemic. With regard to risk of evictions, we found that the majority of landlords were either not in a position to take eviction action or had elected not to do so. Viewed in terms of the percentage of tenancies in current arrears, over 2/3 were not at risk for the same reasons. It is clear that there is some process inertia due to landlord reluctance, but also process lag caused by the temporary legislation. The legislation inherently assumed that landlords would be able to sustain an increase in arrears. However, over 1 in 5 described their PRS income as their primary income and classified it as critical. 1 in 3 of those with arrears rated the impact on their personal finances at 8 out of 10 or higher. 6% of landlords reported that they had already reached a financial tipping point, and a further third could only sustain a further 3 months of rent arrears before being placed into financial difficulty. Many landlords had depleted savings and/or taken on debt as a result of the legislation. In 2007, the Scottish Government's intention was to deliver balanced policy and legislation that safeguards tenants but does not constrain growth. However, over the last decade, the pace of regulatory change has been brisk, and there are concerns surrounding the efficacy of much of the legislation, landlords' knowledge of it, and the ability of local authorities to enforce it. It is within this context that the temporary legislation was enacted. Despite adding to these legislative burdens, the majority of landlords felt that the legislation was necessary to safeguard tenants and protect public services. However, only a minority felt that the legislation that was put in place was fair and balanced. Questions regarding the legislation elicited a strong response from landlords. Many believed that both the legislation and policymakers were biased against landlords, and others felt that policymakers did not fully understand the sector. They suggested that the legislation was based on erroneous assumptions regarding landlords, particularly with regards to their financial resilience. Some pointed to the legislation not only enabling but encouraging negative tenant behaviours in the form of deliberately withholding rent. This phenomenon was also observed in the social rented sector. In addition, despite the UK and Scottish governments creating an unprecedented array of financial protection measures, landlords were generally dissatisfied that sector-specific support was loan-based. The schemes put in place have largely been a failure, with poor awareness levels and take-up amongst both landlords and tenants. The recent creation of a grant fund is a step in the right direction, but the fund is currently grossly undercapitalised. Our research finds that the temporary legislation has protected public services and the most vulnerable during the worst of the pandemic. However, it did so by shifting the financial burden from local authorities and individuals to landlords. It is clear that the ability of landlords to sustain arrears differs from the legislation's underlying assumptions, and it appears that the relationships between policymakers and landlords are at an all-time low. Building on existing landlord dissatisfaction, the scale of the arrears, the perceptions of bias, and the suspected abuses of the system by some tenants have all impacted the attractiveness of the sector, causing a number of landlords to review their position. By the time we interviewed some landlords, they had already sold their properties, ironically resulting in evictions, and others were considering doing so. Landlords leaving the PRS is challenging both in terms of the sector's supply characteristics and levels of professionalism, as both entry barriers and property management complexity continue to increase. The sector would benefit from retaining experienced landlords. However, with looming legislation changes regarding energy performance requirements, rent controls and closer alignment with the social rented sector, it is likely that many more will choose to review their position and exit the market. To combat this, the Scottish Government needs to move beyond the damaging rhetoric and engage directly with Scottish landlords and tenants in order to better understand the sector. If it does not, it may find a dramatically reduced PRS in Scotland. Some may welcome this, but what will take its place?